it still affects me when I see that. But I still think that John's spirit is alive, so it was a natural process.
Pattie Boyd and Yoko Ono were two women closely connected to rock legends, George Harrison and John Lennon. Their relationship was, unfortunately, anything but cordial, as it was strained heavily with rivalry and more.
Simplicity and complexity is not the way I would explain it. It's just human life.
Although they both rolled around within the same inner circles during the height of the Beatles' fame, tensions simmered not so quietly beneath the calm facade of cordiality. Pattie, married to Harrison, reportedly found Yoko's influence on Lennon and, by extension, the band unsettling. Yoko's presence during recording sessions broke the group's unspoken rules and seemingly caused friction that extended to the Beatles' families and friends. While not an open feud, the underlying dislike they both shared had resounding effects on each other. Now Pattie Boyd has decided to let us in on what was really going on with them and why they could never see eye to eye. Join us as we peel back decades of rivalry and bring out secrets some informed few suspected but could never confirm till now. Before we dive deep into the story, it's important to know that although Pattie Boyd and Yoko Ono famously had strong ties to the Beatles, it's very likely that their rivalry and strained relationship may have contributed to the monumental breakup of the legendary band. Shocking, right? Stick around and find how two women's rivalry probably wreaked on one of music's greatest bands. Pattie is finally speaking out after decades of silence, and to really understand the drama, we must return to the origins of it all. The start. First up, there was Pattie Boyd, whose name brought to mind the image of the carefree, cool, and unforgettable fashion of the 60s. This is something that is true even now. She was just a girl from Somerset, with an irresistible shine. Long before she became famous as the muse who won the hearts of George Harrison and Eric Clapton. Colin Jock Boyd and Diana Boyd welcomed their first child, Pattie, into the world on the 17th of March 1944 in Taunton, Somerset. She had an unusual upbringing due to her family's frequent moves. She was born in Scotland, lived in Surrey, and then spent a significant portion of her youth in Nairobi, Kenya. Her younger sister Paula was born there, and Pattie herself began her boarding school journey there when she was just 8 years old. Her parents' sudden divorce had changed her life, and it was when she returned home during a school break that she would discover just how much it would. Not long after that, in 1953, she and her siblings, together with her mother and new stepfather Bobby Gamer Jones, returned to England. Pattie would eventually learn that she had two additional half-sisters from her father's second marriage, in addition to the two half-brothers that he brought with him. As she grew older, so did the complexity of her family's tree. Her frequent moving in the early years and subsequent family drama meant that she had a less than stellar education achievement, as she was bouncing about various Catholic boarding schools until she was 17 years old, with just a handful of O-level credits. Still, this didn't deem her an unnoticed outcast, as many couldn't help but be drawn to her, yet untapped but present charisma. After her mother helped her land a trainee position at the Elizabeth Arden Salon on Bond Street in London, she relocated there that same year. That could have been the end, perhaps just another mundane job in a major metropolis and an end to the story of many side characters, but destiny had other ideas. A Honey magazine client sat in her chair and saw her potential, leading to a proposal that she give modeling a go one day. The suggestion was surprising to Pattie, but she still gave it a try, and as fate would have it, it was a successful attempt that would change her life completely. She began in 1962 and worked out of Paris and London, swiftly becoming a fixture in magazines including Honey, Vanity Fair, Elle, and Vogue. David Bailey, Terence Donovan, and Brian Duffy were among the many famous photographers who took pleasure in capturing her striking look for their magazines. It was an uncanny look, filled with purity and edginess. Twiggy and other girls at the time looked up to Pattie, while Ossie Clark and others created whole collections for her. Her signature style, a mix of miniskirts, huge eyes, and long, straight hair, became iconic along with her as she became a cultural icon. She landed a role in a Smith's Crisps TV commercial in the beginning of 1964. Richard Lester, the film's director, saw her potential and offered her a small role in A Hard Day's Night, which featured the Beatles. George Harrison was her first meeting, and something just seemed to click during their brief encounter. They hadn't had an intense session, but somehow the little chats and a few words exchanged on stage seemed to ignite a fire between them. George asked her out on a date, and although she turned him down at first because she was seeing someone else, they eventually got together, and it would change her life drastically. She became the center of attention as her relationship with George intensified. Out of nowhere, Pattie went from being a mere model to being the woman standing by George Harrison's side, which caused quite a stir in the media at the time. It was like she had suddenly appeared with rock royalty, and everyone simply wanted to know she could stand by his side. How had she managed to capture his attention in a day? Well, let's review the events properly. It was a fine morning on the 2nd of March 1964, when she got into a cab and was going to Paddington Station. She had been instructed by her modeling agency to meet 3 other models at the station clock tower at 8 o'clock in the morning. They were then supposed to meet a film crew on a train, and to the best of her knowledge, that was the whole of the events for the day. After a period of non-stop modeling work, Pattie left her family home at Hurlingham Court and moved in with a friend to a tiny, dilapidated flat in South Kensington. She had a hard time breaking into the industry at first, but she eventually became well known for her work. She was sometimes hired for 3 or 4 events in a single day due to her trademark fresh look. She was 19 with big eyes and a youthful face. Richard Lester, a novice director, cast her in a brief speaking role in a TV commercial for Smith's Crisps in November 1963. It was her acting debut, and she confessed afterwards that it was terrifying for someone as timid as her. A chance opportunity presented itself a few weeks later when her agent, Cherry Marshall, contacted her about a job. Pattie assumed it would be your average day at the office, maybe even posing for a product or clothing shoot. Surprisingly, Richard Lester was there waiting for her at the Park Lane Hilton when she came for the casting. Everything was confidential, so he couldn't reveal much. Her agent didn't contact to let her know she had the part until much later that day. It turns out it wasn't just any regular job she had previously done. She was set to star in the first Beatles film, A Hard Day's Night. The film was supposed to basically feature an imaginary day in the life of the Beatles as they prepared for a major TV performance. The band would try to get away from their adoring audience by boarding a train at Marylebone Station, where Pattie would be among a group of schoolgirls they encounter on that train. While this seemed simple enough, it was anything but. Pattie became really anxious as she only just learned the specifics. She has a nervous conversation with Cherry where she almost breaks down saying, "No, I'm not interested in doing it. I am not capable of doing it." Cherry eventually managed to convince her that it was only a one-liner that could greatly benefit her career. Even though she had never intended to act and despised the thought of being on camera, she still trusted in Cherry's vision for her. Pattie's outfit that day for filming consisted of a gray pin dress, a white shirt, striped tie, and white knee-high socks. And outside London Station was the short halt for the train. When that happened, 4 boys snuck onto the bus and went into the classroom with the girls. The Beatles themselves were the ones it was. Quiet and perceptive, Pattie watched. She described George as having rich chestnut hair and gentle brown eyes, while John appeared somewhat sardonic, Ringo as kind, and Paul as adorable. She had never seen a man more attractive than him, and she happened to find herself seated beside him over lunch. They kept quiet, but being in his presence was thrilling, as if a new chapter had begun, and they were both in the dark. On the train, they started recording her segment. As Paul McCartney's naughty grandpa, Wilfrid Bramble shared a brief moment with the actor. A mock warning about the Beatles, or me prisoners, was made by his character to the females. As the day came to a close and the train began its journey back to London, an unexpected event unfolded. George asked Pattie, "Will you marry me?" as he turned to face her. He seemed serious, but she couldn't help but giggle, because it was difficult to discern if he was joking, because the Beatles had been making jokes throughout the day. "Well, if you won't marry me, will you have dinner with me tonight?" he asked, after she still hadn't spoken. This was an unexpected yet thrilling offer, but it was also one she couldn't really take, because she had already been in a relationship with photographer Eric Swain. His nose was as sharp as his long, dark hair, and he was 10 years her senior. However, Pattie's happiness in the relationship was practically non-existent. The problem was that Eric had the potential to be an overbearing and dull person. George, on the other hand, was the type of person she felt most at ease with because he was her age and could make her laugh. Unfortunately, while he was ideal, she couldn't break her bond with Eric so easily. She politely declined his offer and suggested they all hang out some other time. They arrived at Paddington Station, but George was not pleased at being rejected, so they parted ways. Pattie informed her companions about what had transpired the following day. They were shocked that she turned them down, saying, "You must be mad. George Harrison is an offer you just can't refuse. You simply must go. It would be an incredible adventure." She finally started to understand their point after all their persuasion, but now she was faced with an issue: Eric. Ironically, another photographer, David Bailey, had warned Eric that she would fall for Paul McCartney, but little did he know the threat was from elsewhere. He was devastated to discover that she had been working with the Beatles on set. He sobbed and threatened to harm himself by hurling himself under a bus, but despite feeling bad for him, she was aware that her emotions had shifted. She had to stop acting and eventually decided to leave. Twickenham Studios was the location for Pattie's last photo shoot for A Hard Day's Night, 10 days after filming had wrapped. In her heart, she wished George would bring up the dinner date again, even though she wasn't sure he would. The girls were instructed to pose while they pretended to style the hair of one of the Beatles throughout the shoot. Without hesitating, she approached George. He happened to ask about her lover, which showed that he still had some interest lingering despite the earlier rejection. She told him about her separation from him, and that also meant she could take him on his earlier offer, one he was delighted about. A broad grin spread across his face. He asked, "Would you like to have dinner with me tonight?" Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles, accompanied them that night as they dined at the Garrick Club in Covent Garden. Lattie didn't mind, as Brian was terrific company. She even added that, when it came to fine dining, wine, and London, he was an expert. Also, it might have been more uncomfortable if they were the only ones there, as they were both the timid type, and he served as the perfect icebreaker. They were glued to each other after that meal, and George was introduced to her family a few weeks later, on her 20th birthday. They warmly welcomed him into the family and got along fast, since he was laid back, friendly, and conversational. After that, the couple were inseparable, spending practically all of their time together, as Epstein took them to breathtaking locations like Tahiti, Ireland, and Monte Carlo. By now, They had become a couple so close, only married folks were closer, and that's what they decided to fix. Marriage and divorce. George purchased his initial residence in July 1964. He took his accountant's advice and bought a large, chic home in Chairs, Surrey, in the 1950s, which he called Kinfons. Sadly, George was away often on tours, and Pattie, who was living alone in Kensington at the time, began to experience feelings of isolation. As a result, she returned to live with him, and they began to take their relationship seriously. While traveling through London on a chilly December evening in 1965, George abruptly pulled over the car and proposed. They were outside of Brian Epstein's house before Pattie could completely process it. She remained in the car as George dashed inside to consult with him. Quickly re-entering the room, he smiled as he gasped for air 15 minutes later. Brian had given his approval. They tied the knot at Epsom Registry Office in Surrey on the 21st of January 1966. The location lacked all the glitz and glamour of a high-profile marriage, but it was what Brian, a low-key ceremony. In order to prevent the press and media from causing mayhem, everything had to remain under wraps. She wore red fox fur coat, cream stockings, sharp red shoes, and a Mary Quant silk dress with a pinkish-red hue on that day, while her hair was adorned with a white bow. George opted for something more simple and chic, donning a black suit and a cozy Mongolian sheepskin cloak. They beamed for the camera as they posed on the steps of the registrar. Few guests attended the nuptials, including Brian Epstein, Paul McCartney as George's best man, their parents, siblings, and cousins. Even if it didn't completely work, the press was distracted while John and Ringo were on vacation. A news conference followed the ceremony, but the true partying continued at Kinfons. Sadly, the initial excitement and happiness didn't last for long as things began to take a turn in the marriage. The triangle of love between Eric Clapton, George Harrison, and Pattie Boyd came to light. Eric Clapton broke the news to George Harrison, his best friend, in 1970. "I have to tell you, man, I'm in love with your wife." And it was at this point that George and Pattie's marriage began to unravel. They tried some couples counseling or intervention in the hopes of saving their marriage, but it only serves to make things worse. George was more reclusive and erratic following their 1968 spiritual pilgrimage to India. The change baffled Pattie, and she confessed that he had been nice at first, but that had changed when he began meditating. George, strangely enough, got moodier rather than calmer, which was the opposite of what meditation usually achieved. His behavior changed dramatically as he went from being quiet and spiritual one minute to being adulterous, high, and partying the next. No one could predict which George would appear since his moods changed so rapidly. He became close to Eric Clapton during this period, and the two frequently visited his home. In contrast to George, Eric focused on Pattie, and that was something she noted. He was too interested in her and flirted with her. After he fell head over heels for her, Eric penned the passionate love ballad Layla to convey his emotions. Pattie was taken aback by Eric's seriousness at first. Even though she mistook his letter for one intended for George, he still managed to write her a note. Eric wished Pattie would abandon George and join him because his love for her was so strong. However, Pattie was uncertain. Her marriage to George was in shambles, but she remained. George later confessed that he and Pattie had been apart for so long that he had honestly failed to notice the warning signals when it came to his closest friend's relationship with his wife. George decided to confront Pattie and Eric after overhearing them chatting passionately at a party, which escalated the situation. Eric admitted his love and came clean. "Who are you going home with tonight?" was the question and choice George directed to her. She replied that he would, but would eventually be broken, to learn that he was having an affair with Mo Starkey, who was married to Ringo Starr. She remained with him for 3 more years after that. Even though she was still married to Ringo, Mo began to wear a ring that George had given her publicly, without a care for what anyone would say. That was too much for Pattie to handle, as the embarrassment and guilt were coiled around her neck like a noose. She claimed that Mo's attitude was one of complete disregard, telling her that she could spend the night with George whenever she wanted. She went on to say that she felt Mo Starkey was trying to rub her the wrong way regarding the affair. She entered one of the bedrooms in their enormous 20-room mansion one day and found Mo sprawled out on a mattress next to George. Caught in the act, he defended Mo, saying that she was simply taking a break because she was exhausted. Something in Pattie broke at that very moment, and that was the end of it all. George ironically repeated Eric's words to Ringo, to which he replied, "Better you than someone we don't know." George and Mo's romance ended rather quickly, but the harm had been done. Pattie moved in with Eric Clapton as she abandoned George, but it was a sad transition. It wasn't that Eric had whisked her away, but more like George had simply given up fighting for her. In an unusual turn of events, George once called Eric over, and the two engaged in what seemed like a guitar duel, exchanging solos like competitors in an old tournament, with Pattie's heart as the prize. As they continued to sit in silence, George whispered, "I guess I'd better divorce her." Then Eric Clapton said, "Well, if you do, I suppose that means I've got to marry her." The divorce was finalized in 1977. Pattie and Eric tied the knot 2 years down the road, with Paul and Ringo being among those who showed up to the wedding reception with George. The newlyweds were even serenaded by the 3 remaining Beatles. George and Eric managed to remain friends through thick and thin. He paid Eric and Pattie a surprise visit on Christmas Day while they were having lunch. As far as anyone could tell, he was stuck. Pattie expressed her sympathy for him. Sadly, once again it was clear that the marriage was not going to be the happily ever after she had imagined. After he eventually won Pattie over, Eric cheated, overindulged in alcohol, and developed paranoia and control issues, accusing her of having affairs when she wasn't. His morning meal consisted of Courvoisier mixed with 7-Up. Pattie had to depart when it all got to be too much. An older George reassuringly advised her, "You can always come back if things don't work out." Perhaps that's why, despite everything that had happened, Pattie confessed that one thing had stayed the same. George was still her soulmate, while Eric remains one of her closest friends, despite the sour ending of their relationship. From this, it's easy to see how intricate the history Pattie had with the Beatles was. So who exactly is Yoko, and how did she get into such a rivalry with her? Yoko Ono. Yoko Ono, who was married to John Lennon, caused more controversy than anyone else in the Beatles' group. The group was already neck-deep in infighting, leadership disputes, and individual problems when she showed up. During this period, the Beatles' creative cohesiveness started to slip. Still, how exactly was she likely involved in them splitting up? Well, Yoko met the Beatles for the first time in 1966 when she was 33 years old. At her art show at London's Indica Gallery, she met 26-year-old John Lennon. They didn't start dating until 1968 and got married the following year. Their bond was tight, and this happened to also be a difficult time for the Beatles. The band's rigorous touring schedule came to an end, and the launch of Apple Records, their record label, failed to provide the rest they had anticipated. In an effort to find solace for Paul's substance misuse, the band began practicing transcendental meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. However, the Beatles were left floundering after Brian Epstein, their manager, died of a cocaine overdose in 1967. The band's disintegration began with his demise, as he had been their unifying force. The band was already splintering apart when John attempted to act as a de facto manager in Brian's absence. The Fab Four went to India to attend Maharishi's classes in early 1968. On the other hand, John was the first to return to London after losing faith in the event. There, he started seeing Yoko, leaving his first wife Cynthia behind. Coming off his acid phase and grieving Brian's death, he was left vulnerable. Yoko became the new center of attention for him, as she brought a fresh outlook on life and art for him. For him, this was a type of emotional and artistic rebirth. One of the things that drew John to Yoko was her avant-garde outlook, as he reflected afterwards. He was profoundly captivated by the fresh perspective she offered him on life. After relegating himself to the background, he pushed her into the center of the Beatles' universe. Yoko distinguished herself from the other girlfriends and wives who were never involved in the studio dynamic by being inseparable from John, and perhaps this is where the issues began. Many argue that her presence disrupted the established order, but others counter that, pointing out that the group was already on its way to collapsing by the time she joined. In 1968, while the band was recording the White Album, she was there with a tape recorder and would often go off on rants criticizing the band and the music. John was caught in the middle of the tension between her and Paul, which she brought up in one of the recordings. So she put it, "If he were a girl, I would be jealous." For her, he represented an enemy who would challenge her status in John's life. She effectively formed a barrier that kept them at odds with each other. The animosity between Yoko and Paul persisted even after the untimely passing of John Lennon in 1980. The belief that Yoko viewed Paul as a rival was further fueled by their public disagreement over the credits for some Beatles tunes. It was Yoko's desire to keep her role as John's partner at the heart of the conflict. Rodriguez says, "It was more than simply a business disagreement." With Paul attempting to maintain his status in Lennon's life even after his death, their relationship took on many aspects of a love triangle. Despite the lack of fanfare, the Beatles formally dissolved in 1970. In a press release for his solo album, Paul announced that he and John were no longer working together. The band's profits had taken over any lingering joy, and their musical tastes had begun to diverge. The question of who would take over as band manager was a tricky one also. Alan Klein was backed by John, Yoko, Ringo, and Joe Orge, but Paul wanted Lee and John Eastman, the father and brother of Linda, his future wife, hired as managers. This blew up the disputes to epic proportions. False claims that Yoko had anything to do with the breakup of the Beatles persisted. She firmly denied it. In a 2016 US Weekly essay, "I had nothing to do with breaking up the Beatles, and I think Paul is a pretty cool dude." Paul later cleared her name in a later interview, stating it wasn't Yoko's fault. He did concede that prior to the Yoko fiasco, John had quietly informed the band in 1968 that he was quitting. John adored powerful women, and then he had discovered Yoko. Paul mentioned meeting Yoko and how, although they found her eavesdropping on their recordings to be a little intrusive, they understood and accepted John's undying love for her. The problem between Yoko Ono and Pattie Boyd was probably even simpler. Even though Yoko Ono didn't actively dislike Pattie Boyd, her jealousy towards her was palpable. The Beatles and their fans adored Pattie, but Yoko's studio presence was a constant source of friction. Even though she stayed true to John Lennon throughout Pattie's infidelity, the band's disintegration was still attributed to Yoko's presence. Not everyone was so hard on Pattie, even if she had her share of problems. Her background was another thing that made Yoko unique. While Pattie, being British, fit right in with the Beatles' circle of friends, Yoko, being Japanese, was considered an outcast by many. People were more likely to pick on her because of her cultural background, whereas Pattie was more widely accepted. Despite the critics, the two women were linchpins for several Beatles classics. Together, despite their rivalry, they somehow kept the Beatles from breaking apart earlier than they had, while letting them release a few more timeless classics for fans to enjoy. So, there you have it. Pattie Boyd finally spilling the truth about why Yoko Ono was so incredibly jealous of her. What do you think? Do you agree with Pattie's take on the whole drama? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more juicy stories just like this. And hey, click on the next video on the screen to keep the conversation going. See you in the next one.